Hi, my name's Lynn Porter, and today we're going to look at the background to the amino acid codes that we use here in HET. And to start the story off, I want to go down a little bit of a historical journey with you. About 100 years ago to San Francisco and a doctor called Albert Abrams. Now, Albert Abrams stirred up things a little bit during his day because he got some incredible results with patients in a very unorthodox way. To put it simply, he believed that everything was connected by a universal field that pervades everything and everybody. And of course we know that to be the case today, and some of our leading scientists and physicists are right there on the edge of science with that point of view. But 100 years ago that was a little bit threatening to the powers that be, especially with the kind of results that Albert was getting with his technology and his approaches. Very simply, what he found out was that each disease that he worked with, say for example cancer or malaria, had a particular frequency. In other words, the cells radiated a particular signal, which he was able to measure in ohms on some of his machinery and instrumentation. Not only that, but let's take malaria for example. What he found out was that numerical value or code or rate, radionic rate, also had a cure that measured at the same frequency. So it would be the exact same numerical rate for the cure as for the disease. So he was able to get some pretty spectacular results during that time. Now, to say he was persecuted and discredited at every turn is probably an understatement. And not only that, but his followers who carried on his work and developed his instrumentation also too had the same experiences. So really radionics tended to go underground. But what we've got here today are amino codes, and you may ask what they're doing here in HET. Well, to put it very simply, they are restoring the template. Now, amino acids are very, very simple proteins, and what they do is they actually create the internal mechanisms of every cell in the human body. And how that cell behaves and how it sends messages and communicates with the other cells around it to direct the function of the body depends on the way these amino acids, these very simple proteins that join together, come together to do the job. Now, you might be aware of the fact that the amino acids are what make the DNA in the cells, and the DNA is like a genetic database of information, of experience that comes not only from previous cells but from previous generations. And what can happen is that gets damaged along the way. That could be environmentally or through experiences, and the messages that go into the cell actually start to hold damaged information within that DNA. Now, if that damaged information gets passed down from one generation to another, then obviously there are going to be triggers that bring that up again in the new generation. The theory is with the amino acid codes is that by putting in the perfect amino acid, it's actually restoring the template of how those amino acids should come together and work in the first place. I kind of liken this to an analogy of what happens with bad knitting. And if you're anything like me at knitting, what happens is that you can work away and knit away and drop a few stitches along the way and just carry on and leave them there. Now, that's what my knitting's like anyway. Now, if you can imagine wearing this jumper that's got quite a few holes in it, and not very likely, but somebody comes along and says, oh, I really like that jumper, can I copy it? And you haven't got the knitting pattern anymore, so you let them have the jumper and they copy that knitting stitch by stitch, and they come across the holes in it and they think that they're supposed to be there, and so they leave a hole there and they carry on and they leave the next hole there, and guess what, they probably drop a few more stitches in their own right as well, and they wear their jumper, and of course with no knitting pattern somebody else comes along and copies it and then copies it again. Well, that is exactly the same, that holy mess that you end up with at the end of the day, as how information is passed down from generation to to generation in the form of this DNA information database. The information that's passed down has been subjected to the experience of the previous generation's lifetime, and all that information is held and passed on to the new generation. And this is where it becomes exactly like the drop stitches in the knitting pattern, where you've got holes where there should be perfect information to respond. Now, what the amino essences do is to restore the original template back in to the DNA, a little bit like somebody coming along down the line and say, well, hang on, you're knitting this jumper, here's the knitting pattern, follow that and it'll make it a lot easier. So they've actually got the exact set of instructions that they need to do, rather than second guessing where there's a hole in that information. Now, if you cast your mind back to when you did negative patterns in Stepping Stone 7, you'll remember that there was a little exercise set in there where you had a circular picture and you had to choose 2 colours and have a go at just filling in the pattern however you felt it should be filled in. Once you'd done that, you were actually able to look at an analysis and interpret things about the way you behave, the way you go about things, the way you learn, the way you feel, your attitude, your values, and so on. Well, everything is a hologram of everything else, and I'll come back to explaining that again in a minute. But what I'd like you to understand at the moment is that that exercise and that circle is actually a hologram of the cell. And although doing that little exercise showed the way that you behaved and your thinking and feeling and so on, so too in your cell, in each single cell of your body, and we've got about 10 trillion of them, inside each of those cells you have got these amino acids joining up together, making protein, shifting, shape-shifting, dancing in the cell, and that actually informs the behaviour of the cell and how it communicates to the other cells around it. And it is that process that actually creates our structure and our life process. So what do these patterns do? Well, when you did your own pattern, you understood to a certain extent, and I think you're probably surprised how accurate this is, how you go about things and how you learn. How does that relate to the cell? Everything in the universe is a hologram. If you look out to the skies and the heavens and see the stars and the planets above you that go on infinitely, you'll realise that that sense of going outward is also the same as going inward, into the very cells, into the very molecules and the atoms and the nucleus and the electrons that spin. It is the same but on a different scale. Everything is a smaller fragment of everything else. And that's what we mean by a hologram. Now, the human cell is also a hologram of the human body. And how that works is really quite amazing, because every cell is capable of doing everything that a human being does. So it is really like a little miniature human being. It can breathe, it can reproduce, it can eat, it can excrete. It does everything that a human being does, and it can communicate very specifically to all the surrounding cells around it as well. Now, the universe, as I said, is a hologram of the cell. And the way the cell behaves is a hologram of how the human being behaves. And this is where it becomes to be representative of doing that pattern. So in doing that, you're looking at colouring in really the same way that every cell in your body is performing. And so that is part of the whole hologram. The patterns that the human being structures is also the pattern of what the cell structures. So this is what I mean by the holographic process. Now, as I said, everything in the universe naturally creates patterns. The universe is made up of a series of sacred geometric patterns, and that can be the helix on a snail shell, or it can be the radial seeds on the head of a sunflower as it follows the sun across the sky. But everything in nature forms what is called a sacred geometry, and those patterns are repeated over and over again. William Blake, famous poet and metaphysicist of his time, was well aware of this, and this message has gone through nature, this understanding repeated again and again. So everything in nature, from the universe to the cell, provides an infinite number of patterns. So, what is it about the cell? Well, it is the proteins that are in the cell that make those patterns. So let's have a little look at what the cell involves. Here we've got the nucleus, and inside the nucleus we've got the DNA. These little squiggly bits here, little strands, are the DNA or the amino acids that come together in different ways and shapes to form the protein, and it's all encapsulated in this nucleus that is surrounded here by a nuclear membrane that encases it all. Within the cell you've got various other things that do different jobs, and that information comes from the nucleus into the cell to carry out the work. Now, just to mention what we've got here, we've got these little slipper arrangements here which are called the mitochondria. Now, the mitochondria are the powerhouses. They actually store the energy in the cell, but they do have their own form of DNA in it as well, mitochondrial DNA, which we'll be mentioning later. So, as I've said, it is the amino acids in the cells that join up in different patterns to make the proteins. And it looks a little bit like this pearl necklace here, where you have strings of pearls. The pearls are the individual amino acids that come together in different lines and sequences. And the way they join up forms the proteins that work in the cell. And here you've got a diagrammatic representation of how they come together in little bases of 4. These amino acids come together in little bases of 4, and these 4 bases join up with all the others to make the different shapes and patterns and dances in the cells. Now, when I talk about the bases, these are like the basic letters of the DNA alphabet. You know, in our alphabet we've got 26 letters, and out of those letters we can make different words. Well, it's very much the same. We've got 4 letters here of the bases of these amino acids, and they join up in different ways to make different words. So the amino acids come together, they form sequences, and these join up with other amino acids making protein structures and chains. So you've got an idea of how they all come together, all these amino acids, to form chains. And they can get quite complex as they join up together, as you can see from this protein model here. You get an idea of that. The behaviour in a cell is triggered by picking up signals through little antennae on the outside of the cell wall called IMPs, intramembrane proteins. These signals are about the way we feel or think, about our beliefs and our attitudes, and that message is then transmitted to the inside of the cell. So they're like little aerials. If you could imagine, this is the cell membrane here, like the roof, and you've got this aerial, this little antennae, picking up around the environment all the messages coming in, and those are messages going to be the chemicals that are in the system, your feelings, your thoughts, your emotions, which are all chemicals. They're emotional molecules, and they actually attach to these imps, go through the membrane and transmit the messages to the inside of the cell, and the inside of the cell works with that information and then refers it to the database within the DNA, so it knows what to do and how to respond and how to send messages back. So the way these messages transmit, they create a charge, like a positive or negative, which, like magnets, either repels or attracts the ends of the amino acid sequences, which form the snake-like proteins. So it does work a bit like magnets, and this is what makes them dance within the cell. It gives the cell its pattern, and they are constantly changing and moving. And here we've got a visual on how they all link up with one another in that way and create these intrinsic patterns within the cell. And here you've got a picture here of the different ones within the cell, giving you an idea of how those patterns form and how they connect with one another. It's quite interesting, isn't it, that positive emotions create very stable patterns and structures in the cell, but negative emotion messages coming through tend to disintegrate those patterns and, of course, We all know that stress creates ill health in different ways. So when a new experience comes into the cell, it tries to form a pattern. Sometimes, if it can't find the right piece to fit the pattern, it realises something's missing, like the hole in the knitting pattern, and it goes to the database to get the information to create the pattern and fill in the missing piece, so the cell knows how to behave properly, if you like. This is how it accesses what I refer to as the spiritual DNA. It goes to the database to find out how this problem has been dealt with in the past. It might not have been in that cell's experience, but how do other cells deal with this in the past, so it can fill in the missing piece of the jigsaw and behave properly. There you've got an idea of how these form together, these proteins form together within the DNA spiral, and the ATCG are the 4 bases that link together, so you can see how they interact in different ways. And here you've actually got a photograph of what they look like, coated in these amazing proteins that are constantly shifting and moving to the messages, responding to the messages coming in. Okay, now these bases come together, the 4 bases come together in 3 different ways. So there are 64 possible combinations of these 3 bases coming together. When they're in one of these bases coming together in 3, they're actually called codons. And interestingly enough, there's only about 20 of these codons that form in an activated way within the human cell, and a lot of them are not even activated yet, and that's something that we come back and look at in the book that explains all this. So DNA then is a huge information database that carries the complete set of instructions for making all the proteins a cell will ever need to behave in any way it needs to behave. Although there are only 4 different bases in DNA, the A, C, G and T, the order in which those bases occur determines the information to make a protein. As I said earlier, just like the 26 letters of the alphabet combine to form words and sentences. So if you compare, for example, the words rat and tar and art, they're the same 3 letters, but they come together in different ways to have completely different meanings. And with DNA, you've got GAC, AGC and CGA, the same 3 letters, but completely different meanings to the cell. And these were aspartic acid, serine and arginine. So you can see how complex this all is in coming together. Now, going to the DNA to get the template is a little bit like going to knit the jumper from the one that was knitted before and it's full of holes. The genetic information that is carried over from generation to generation and the experiences and the damage. For example, when you did Stepping Stone 4, which looked at diet and nutrition, we talked about artificial sweeteners called aspartame and how we know that causes genetic damage. Now that damage is passed on from one generation to the other. So when an environmental message comes in and the cell doesn't know how to complete that, it doesn't know how to behave with that message coming in, it will go to the DNA database to find the missing pieces, and if you've got a hole there, it will actually trigger a genetic response to that situation. You can see now why putting in the knitting pattern helps to put right all that bad knitting, and how you can reform it the way it should look. So too when you put in the templates for the amino codes, it's putting in a call to give the information to the cells that has been damaged and passed on. So it's able to follow the instructions and make things the way it should be. Okay, so when you put in the original amino acid codes, you're going back to that original knitting pattern that was lost sight of so long ago. Now, how do you take the amino acid codes? Well, have your set of amino acids, and there is a little film that shows you how to muscle test so you know which ones you need to take. It shows you how to make them up and take them. It is in the booklet that goes along with that, so you have all of that information. But what I would like to just say to you to finish off our presentation is, if you reknit that jumper, you've got your knitting pattern, you've got all your instructions there, and you put it together again, and you're using frayed wool, it's not going to last very long, is it? It's just going to tear and create more holes again eventually. So if you replaced it with proper, strong, healthy wool, you'd have a much better looking jumper and a longer lasting one at the end of the day, wouldn't you? So too with your amino acids. So if when you're taking your amino acid codes, you really want to see some effects with this, then you really need to start taking some pure protein. And I would suggest here soya protein, a vegetable protein, which is the purest and highest source of protein that you can get, which is actually feeding the cells with the natural resources of the best quality that they need in order to be able to respond to this new call that's being put back into the cells, this healing that's going into the cells. So you're giving it the best in every way possible. You're giving it the instructions, the directions, the call that it should be, and the resources to work with. Now, we do go into a lot more information about the amino codes. That's just very briefly explaining to you how they work in the cells and how it has a genetic influence to keep the cells healthy and well and functioning properly. We've got films, we've got the book to go along with this, and as ever, if you've got any questions, please contact me, Lynn, Lin, @hetwebsite.com, and we can go through it together. Thanks for your time.